listening to Around Comics. 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 You're listening to Around Comics.
From Chicago, this is Around Comics, the comic culture podcast where we talk about everything in and around the world of comics and comics culture. I'm your host, Christopher Niesman, and I am joined, as always, by my partner in crime, Mr. Brian Salazar.
I'm floating away in Chicagoland and not in a
I
good
know,
way.
it's time to build a boat. I got nine
Or-
inches of rain in the last 18 hours here in Milwaukee.
Is that the city of rain? Is Milwaukee? What does Milwaukee stand for? Is that I don't.
Dirty
water?
I forget the
Stinky
scene
water?
out of I forget the scene out of Wayne's World where Alice Cooper, I think it's like, the good
Explains-
Earth. I think, is that it?
I don't
The
know.
Good
I don't
Place or something.
Enough of that talk.
Enough of
Introduce
that.
our guest.
Enough of that. Because speaking of talking, we have a wonderful guest this week. It is old friend in comics. I don't know if he's ever been on the show before. I know we've talked plenty at conventions and all sorts of other stuff. Mr. Jim Rugg. Jim, how you doing?
I'm doing great, guys. Thanks for having me here.
Have you ever been a guest on the show before?
I think I've been on a podcast. I don't think I've done a video since you've been doing video. I don't think I've been here.
Yeah, this is new for us. So it's your select group. You're like our third guest.
The world
on
did
video.
not see enough of us before. Now
Yes.
they need to watch us do this.
Faces for
stupid
radio,
shit.
Jim. Faces for radio.
Three guests in makes me kind of a guinea pig. So I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. But
You know, as always with Around Comics, it's basically whoever we can convince to come on. You know, it's don't feel too good
Hooker
about
crook.
it. Don't feel too bad about it. You know,
Yeah.
we can get you on.
It's like
Right now,
Andy Parks, Tony Moore, and you now, I think.
oh, that's pretty good company. I'll take that.
Oh, and
We don't
and
mess
Tim
around.
Seeley, we had Tim Seeley and Tom King.
Oh yeah, Tom King and Tim Seeley.
Jeez.
So
Just-
it's like
That's a good list.
he forgets about the writers. He doesn't like writers.
I'm getting old, Sal. I'm
Right.
forgetful. See, I don't think of Tim and Tom as guests. They're in the family. Does that sound good? Is that a good cleanup?
way to cover your ass on that.
There you go.
Good job.
Yeah. Well, Tom King's going to be back with a Comics 101.
Well, we still have some work to do. We did our first one.
I'm done with my work.
Yeah.
I had
This guy-
the
so-
biggest lift.
So Jim, Chris makes a challenge to Tom King because Tom was a fan of the show before he became a big DC Comics writer and everything.
Eisner winning. Yeah.
And he loved when we used to do these episodes, Comics 101, when we would sort of delve into the history of a certain subject or a book or a writer or whatever it was. And he said he always missed that we didn't do those anymore. So we made a challenge to him. Chris decided if we did 3 Comics 101 episodes, new ones, he would have to come on and do one for Adam Strange. So Chris being Chris, he picks the 8-issue run of Roy Thomas and Neil Adams X-Men. Like
10
that's
to
his-
11 issues, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, it took you about what 15 minutes to do research for that. One interview with Roy Thomas on Comics. What's that old magazine? I can't think of the Comics Insider. Or
It
whatever.
was a lot of research, and
Yeah.
we squeezed a 2-hour episode out.
That's brilliant. That makes sense to me. I do a podcast. We do one issue for an hour. So 8 to
There you
10
go.
issues.
This is true.
That's an epic.
Which, speaking of, let everyone know out there, they probably already know what podcast you host or co-host. What podcast is it?
It's Cartoonist Kayfabe, and I co-host it with Ed Piskor, another Pittsburgh-based cartoonist. And you guys come out of Chicago, we come out of Pittsburgh, and we've been doing it for over a year. So it's on YouTube also. It's also available as a podcast, most of the episodes, wherever people listen to these things. You can find us there, Cartoonist Kayfabe.
Nice.
It's basically the only comic book podcast I listen to anymore. And I generally get upset because you guys do a great job and you make me spend money on stuff. And I hate you for making me. I just ordered the absolute or the what was the last one you just did? The
Absolute Batman Year One.
Yeah, I listened to 10 minutes of you guys fawning over it and your excitement.
It's a beautiful book.
I just went online and ordered it. I'm like, yep, okay, I'll just order that. I have another one, some other book, Absolute you did, and I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna order it. You guys are infectious with it. Your excitement and enthusiasm for comics is awesome.
We're old enough that I think we started reading before good design and production really were part of comics. And now, and also things would be out of print. So, you know, depending on what you were into, it could be almost impossible to track this stuff down. And I've just never adjusted to this era now where almost everything is in print and it's designed well, it's produced well. The reproduction is often the best it's ever been.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like a kid in a candy shop in terms of comics and what's available now. So yeah, it's we're not going to run out of things to showcase anytime soon.
And I loved the sorry, I'm just gonna fawn. This is my chance.
Fawn away.
To fawn on you because I love your podcast. I think it's great, and I loved the episode you did on the Outlaw comics, and I think you are the only other people I've ever heard talk about grips. That was, I remember, like, I was trying to explain that book to Chris years ago because I'm like, there was this crazy, super violent black and white comic. I don't know who did it. I never saw it again. I had 5 issues of it when I was in my 20s, and I loved it at that time, and I've never even seen it again. And then sure enough, it pops up on one of your episodes.
It's popped up on more than one. It's Tim Vigil's first work. So we interviewed him at one point. That was a big thrill to me. I don't know how much you guys are into Faust, but that was a really important comic to me as a kid because I found it when I was probably too young to have it. But as an adult, I've talked to other cartoonist friends and it's surprising. We all knew that book somehow, it was like the dirty movie or something that everybody would try to rent behind their parents' back.
Right.
We all knew it. And so, over the years, I became a fan of Tim Vigil's, tracked down different things, and Grips is like his first thing. And I did a video drawing Grips. It was kind of a sped up version of me inking this drawing of Grips.
Nice.
But the great story with Grips, the character in the comic, the Vigilante, is a cartoonist. So his day job is he draws comics, and the comic book that he draws is Fat Ninja. And so Silverwolf also published that comic book. It's such a cool concept. My wife is a fan of the concept, not necessarily a fan of either book. Hasn't read either of the books.
It's very meta.
But she loves that concept. And it is kind of cool, that the character in one comic is doing this comic that you can buy. And, Fat Ninja is kind of like Beverly Hills Ninja, the Chris Farley movie in a lot of ways. And even the timing kind of lines up right. So it's a fun story.
So in the production of Fat Ninja, who actually is titled as the writer and artist of Fat Ninja? Is it?
That's a good question because it's not. Well, Chris Silver is titled as the creator of everything in Silverwolf. I can't remember who the artist is on Fat Ninja, and if they, if it's the same, if they use the name, if they kayfabe that it's actually the artist from the character from Grips.
I also love that you guys use the wrestling term in your pod, the kayfabe. That whole concept is fascinating to me. And it's perfect. What you guys have done with that show is just all right. I'm done fawning over the podcast.
Turn this podcast off right now and go listen to this one because it's obviously much better than ours.
It is. It's much better. So just go. Yeah, you can just go listen to theirs and quit wasting your time with us clowns.
Well, kind of spinning off of that, Jim, you have such an amazing love of 90s independent comics. I mean, obviously a lot of your career it gets sewn back to the 70s, and we'll talk about Afrodisiac and your new Kickstarter comic Octobriana, which we're going to talk about a lot, I hope. But this is one of my favorite things that is yours but not yours that I picked up, and I think it was at Challengers whenever you were signing there. This is just BW Black and White. Talk a little bit about this little treasure.
All right, great. I'm glad you bring that up, Chris. I started, I like back issue diving and bin diving. And once the internet made comics available, I kind of went through my list of, whatever my dream comics were and tracked down a lot of them. And I started to get real excited going to these like unsorted dollar boxes and 50-cent sales and just pulling out things that I had never seen before. Like my biggest favorite thing to find in comics is something new that I don't know about or looks different than anything I've seen. And I start pulling out like the 80s black and white comics. You know, what happens is those things just get devalued. You know, like when I started buying them, that was like the worst comics on earth, you know, was the 80s black and white explosion and then implosion comics. So I was finding them for, you know, anywhere from 10 for $1 up to $1 and just buying them. Most of them I had never heard of. There were so many produced. And for anybody that's not familiar with the black and white explosion, in the mid 80s, after the Turtles came out and they were super successful, everybody was like, we can just self-publish our own black and white comic. It's really inexpensive to make those. And then there were like 18 or 19 comic distributors and you could distribute through all of them. Everybody was looking now for the next Turtles. So all these black and white comics were published all over the place. You know, it was no longer had to be out of New York City, and they just flooded the market. This lasted for a couple years, and then everybody was like, these are garbage. You know, we're done ordering them. And then it collapsed. You know, all these publishers went away and self-publishers stopped. And a lot of them only published 1 or 2 issues because, you know,
it was a roll of the dice.
Exactly.
We were talking about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle Artisan edition I just got from IDW, and continue to say that TMNT was maybe the most influential comic of the 80s in a lot of different ways. But because of that like onslaught of independent creators that it said, hey, yeah, go try it out.
It really was. And, you know, we've been talking to guys that came out of Mirage. So like Steve Bissett's and Rick Veitch's, and then Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird go on to form Tundra on one hand, which publishes all kinds of people, Alan Moore, Bill Sienkiewicz, Scott McCloud, The Crow. And then on the other hand, Peter Laird does the Xeric Foundation that publishes young cartoonists for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years, like maybe a dozen a year. So, you know, they had this huge influence on self-publishing and even on Image Comics guys, because they just started, you know, when you think of creator ownership, those guys were pretty loud and big examples of successes in creator ownership. Mm-hmm. So to get back to that zine that you were holding up, Chris, I started buying this stuff because it was like, I had never seen it before. And my friends didn't know what it was. Usually they might know 1 or 2 and be like, oh, look for Barbarian Tales or something. But for the most part, it was just like random, you know, it'd be a cool cover, or I'd flip through it and be like, this art looks good. Let's take this home and see who this is. And in a lot of cases, they might've only made 1 or 2 comic books. You know, it's really fun. And it's part of what I like about when I was a kid, I would buy comics at a flea market. So it kind of brings me back to that of just this random, whatever happens to be in that dollar box, grab a couple that look interesting and go with it. And honestly, I just, you know, they speak to me because it's usually 1 or 2 people doing everything themselves, not really following rules because they don't know any better. And it's just kind of entertaining, different looking comics. So that zine then was me putting together interesting panels and pages and collaging things from these comics, ads and editorial pages, you know, all these different pieces that I just thought were interesting, and put them together into a zine called BW Zine for black and white. Mm-hmm. And that's how that came about. So it's kind of my celebration of what I'm pulling out of what look like junk boxes, but I don't know, they speak to me. What can I say?
It's awesome. It's the one book that you can buy from you like at a convention that you won't sign.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, the only thing I've really done on that book is the cover. Everything else is just, it's found material. I've excavated it, if you will.
You're a comic archaeologist.
I watch, there was a documentary years ago called Scratch, and it was about DJs that would go into like these record store basements and attics, you know, looking for the best records and sometimes sorting through like rat carcasses to find them. I feel a real kinship to that. And BW is the fruits of those labors.
That's awesome.
I wanted to ask you about I mean, obviously you seem to have a love of the 70s, you know, and a lot of the stuff that you do, Afrodisiac, obviously, and I think just you seem to have a kinship with it, but you're not really old enough to have grown up in the 70s, right? Like I was wondering, did you have like older siblings? Because I grew up kind of in the 70s, but I was
Sal's the elder statesman here by at least a couple years.
Yeah. But I had older sisters, and so like all the music that they listened to and the things that they were into, I obviously was attracted to. So I was wondering how did your love of the 70s come about?
Well, I was born in 77, so I don't remember it firsthand, but I grew up, it was pre-internet. So like in the 80s where I grew up, it would have been like a small rural setting in southwestern Pennsylvania. And it was like we were years behind, cultural centers or something
Right.
like that. And especially, like I was watching old movies on TV. So it wasn't like it was new stuff. It would have been the things from the 70s, it would have been those kind of staples that were crossing my path. I had an older sister, but she wasn't like sending movies my way or great music or anything, but it was just what I could find, like in the middle of nowhere, like in a small rural area, you're kind of stuck with whatever you can get on that television or whatever you find in flea markets. When video stores showed up in the mid 80s, that was huge. But a lot of that stuff would have been, movies from the 70s and
Sure.
things. So, I think a lot of that developed naturally. And then as I got older and I got to, like track down things that I had heard of or find whatever I wanted to watch and read, the 70s did, like I did feel a kinship to that. Even though I was probably a little bit younger, a lot of the stuff I was consuming would have been a few years older. So, I'm watching movies from the 70s and the 80s.
Right.
It all kind of works out in the end.
Well,
I grew up in Southern Illinois, and it's kind of the same thing. I found Doctor Who through PBS, and the comics that I was reading were like Byrne Claremont X-Men from like the late 70s, and this is in the mid 80s. So
yeah, it's a hard thing to explain, I think, to people now with phones and smartphones and whatever you think of, you can instantly look up and watch and read. It just wasn't that way. It was like you were stuck with whatever you could find, and in the middle of nowhere with no car, it was like a good garage sale would have gotten me through 3 months. Like,
oh sure,
it just wasn't a place to go. I didn't find comic book stores until I was about 15 or 16, is about when Image started, and I needed those comics. Like I was hooked at that point. I had to have them. So once I got a driver's license, I was able to drive like 45 minutes to a comic book store, and that really opened everything. And before that, it would be kind of a special occasion because I knew where the comic book store was. I just wasn't old enough to drive. So I'd get there a couple of times a year, which is when I found Faust, probably, 13 or 14. My parents take me and drop me off for an hour. But it was a real special, rare occasion. And I would have to make hard choices, like I might've had $20 and that's it. So my head would be spinning around with things I'd never heard of or seen.
For 6 months of issues that you're going to stock up on.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that, go ahead.
I was going to say, it brings up, something I've thought about in the past of like, I grew up in an era where there was 3-4 TV channels, and whatever my dad wanted to watch, that was what was on the TV. Like there was no other choice. So I grew up watching Westerns and black and white movies and that kind of thing, and grew up with an appreciation for that stuff that I still love today. But like my kids, if they don't like what I'm watching, there's their phone and their computer, they can put on whatever they want. Usually it's some YouTube video, which now I taunt them that I'm a YouTube influencer. And
I'm sure they're watching you on their phones.
No, never.
It's neat kind of thinking back on that. I don't want to, say, oh, back in the old timey days, whenever we would buy a comic and now you'd have to read that comic over and over. But it's kind of how it was. I mean, you weren't, I wasn't making weekly trips to the comic shop and buying, 5, 8, 12 comics a week and just kind of digesting them. And I think a lot of, you were talking earlier that, I mean, we're at a time where we have so much available to us that I think we consume a lot of entertainment and comics. I remember, I have comics in my collection that are so dog-eared from reading over and over and over again. And I'll come across panels that I know as an aspiring artist, before I decided to become a graphic designer, I wanted to be a comic book artist, and I would draw panels over and over and over again. Those pages and panels are burnt into my brain. And I think that limited availability of comics really kind of fed into that.
Yeah, when we first started Cartoonist Kayfabe, Ed made a video about an X-Men comic from his childhood. I think it was from the Extinction Agenda, but it had that quality, that dog-eared quality where like you would see him as he flipped through it, where the pages just had no stiffness at all. Like it had been read so many times. It was just like, just this broken in, worn out comic book. And I'm the same way. When I started reading them, I used to keep them in a shoebox, and I'd have maybe a dozen comics, and I'd get a new one, and then I'd be carrying that box around. And it was just rereading the same stuff over and over, copying the same drawings again and again. That was great. I love that stuff. And it's such a different time now. I accumulate so many comics from stuff that people send us, or things that I decide I have to have, and you're able to track them down now instantly, that I can't read everything anymore. And it's so, I don't know. It's a weird thing. Like it's not a thing to complain about in any way. It's like I have too many comics, I can't
wonderful
keep up.
And horrible.
It really is, though. I end up missing, I miss so much, but I think everybody does too, and you'll hear recommendations from people, and you hear the same recommendation 3 or 4 times, and then that gets to the top of my pile. I realize, like, that's usually my indicator, especially if it's something a little off the beaten path. If I hear about it twice in the same week from different people, it's kind of like that's my cosmic sign to go ahead and watch that movie or read that book or comic if it pops up 2 or 3 times.
Were you always into more underground comics and black and white stuff, outlaw comics, or was there a time where you were reading more mainstream superhero stuff or that kind of thing? I started out with mainstream because I was reading them. My first comic I bought at a drugstore. So, I was reading off of the newsstand. There was a gas station where I would buy like Wolverine number 10. I distinctly remember buying at a gas station by my house because they would get a few comics in, but that's what I had. Like, I didn't have the comic book store. So it would just be like, there was a magazine wherever you
shop.
Could find something. I remember that same thing. It was like there was a 7-Eleven and a like pharmacy next to each other in my town, and like they would carry different comics. They each had a spinner rack, and then there was a comic book store, but then there would be like there might be a couple of packs at the J.C. Penney's, or there, so wherever you could like find
you had to hustle around town.
You did.
Yeah.
And it was surprising, like, especially you start buying those multi-packs or whatever, you might get some. That would be the time you would hear or find something new that you didn't even know existed. I love that stuff, and it's part of why I still dig through those 50-cent boxes looking for that thing that I don't know I need or want, or even that it exists. Yeah. But I went through the normal stuff, like I was a Marvel. When I first started reading, it was Marvel, and it was a great time for Marvel. It was right, I guess, shortly after Jim Shooter left. And so like you had my first New Mutants was New Mutants 87. It was the first Cable. And I was on board,
Sure.
Rob Liefeld, inked by Todd McFarlane on the cover. And it was like, yes. And I was following artists from really early on. So I recognized, a handful of these guys. My first X-Men was Jim Lee's X-Men 248. It was a fill-in. It was like Jim Lee's first X-Men ever. It was a fill-in issue by him. So just very random that this is, these are the books that I got, but it was a cool time period. I can remember picking up, I think it was New Mutants 100, double-sized final issue, getting ready for X-Force.
Oh, yeah.
And like Uncanny X-Men 275, double issue, Jim Lee. And it was like the greatest week of my life, through age 16 or 17 or something, till some girl talked to me. That was probably the highlight of my life up to that point. But, like it was a really good, if you're buying off the news, if you're buying off a rack, like from newsstands, it was a pretty good time period. McFarlane, he was finishing up Amazing Spider-Man when I started reading Spider-Man, and then started on Spider-Man. So I loved all those guys. Like I said, whenever Image starts, that's whenever it's like, okay, I've got to find a comic book store because I've got to get these things.
Yep.
And that
Savage
exposed
Dragon
me to everything. I loved that book, man. And I did not expect to, but that was the one that out of all that first Image run, Savage Dragon was the one after I had read everything. It was like, that's it, and that was a real different book. It was like an R-rated superhero coming from a guy who was reading Marvel and DC. That was big, man. And I was the right age for it, where it was like, I wanted to hear these superheroes cussing and super violent and stuff. It was the kind of movies I was watching too.
And so that's 90s, and out of all those, Spawn and Savage Dragon are still running.
Yeah.
Are there any others out? Those are really the two that survived, right?
I think so. Yeah. Everybody else had their studios, and it seemed like probably as things collapsed, it just wasn't worth their time to draw the comics, and it just became like properties or whatever.
Sure.
When did you start thinking you wanted to make comics, or when did you start making comics?
The very first comic I bought, before I got home, I saw the credits in the front and was like, somebody's a penciler or an artist on this. And I was drawing, you know, like I was the kid in school that was always drawing, but I was drawing like movie characters, wrestlers. So I was drawing stuff that looked like comics. I just wasn't reading comics. Once I got hold of the comics, it was like, hold up my notebook here, hold up the comic here. This is me. So I always say, like, before I got home from that first comic, you know, buying that first comic, that's what I wanted to do. And it really never changed. And that's what led me to the indies, you know. So I went from like liking all these Marvel guys and seeing Image with early computer coloring and stuff. That was all great, but it didn't look like what I was drawing in my sketchbooks. So when I get to like some black and white comics, it was like, all right, now we're getting closer. Like, this is,
I can do this.
This looks like what I do. And I was getting bored with the Marvel stuff at that point. You know, they would cycle through those stories where it's like, okay, each year Venom comes back, or each year, you know, whatever is repeated. And after a couple cycles, I was just done with those. If I didn't find indie comics, I probably would have moved on to something else. But I found indie comics, and then it was like, all right, this is Frank Miller was the first guy that I really was into, and he was away whenever I started reading comics. So like I got all of his back issues. I traded a bunch of Rob Liefeld New Mutants for Frank Miller's Daredevil run. That worked out pretty well. But he comes back about the time that I start getting access to comic book stores. He's doing Sin City.
Yeah.
And Sin City, man, it blew my mind because, like, one, it's just him. So that was a big revelation. And then the lettering looked a little bit weird, you know, like it looked just weird enough that it something in my brain clicked, where it was like, oh, okay, it doesn't have to be perfect, or it doesn't have to look like Marvel. And I loved Sin City. So it was like, now I'm seeing this comic with some rough edges, or the lettering looks, you know, different. It's not as smooth and perfect. And, you know, it was just on at that point. I started ordering things like from Kitchen Sink and Tundra catalogs through the mail to try to get this stuff that I couldn't find anywhere else. And it was all those black and white books. And, you know, I mean, that's what I was doing. I had no idea how you were going to color. I had no computer, you know, it just was beyond me. It was so hard to like make my drawings look like those polished comic books.
That's such a good point, because it was an exciting time, because there were so many books coming out, and it was like, oh, it doesn't have to look like Sal Buscema. It doesn't have to look like those guys that are great. It doesn't have to look like John Byrne. You know, it's like, oh, there's other ways to make comics. And that was really exciting to a lot of people to sort of realize, oh, I could do this. Maybe this is something I can do too. So
it was huge. And for trying to make stuff, I couldn't use certain tools, or I didn't have the right tools. And so you'd find this indie book, like I remember Dead World by Vince Locke. And it was like these scratchy lines, like, you know, it was like a pen that he was drawing with or something. And again, it just kind of looked like me. The Crow was huge because there was all kinds of media, you know? So like, I'd look at the Crow and be like, you can do like a painting or something in the middle of this, or this is like a pencil drawing. You know, it was just eye-opening.
Well, I see that Bill Sienkiewicz Electra on your door behind you, so I'm sure that was, you know, talk about use of media and doing something different. I mean, that was, I remember sort of hating his stuff when it first hit, because it was so different and I didn't quite understand it, and it was like, what am I looking at? But it was only a matter of time before it was just like,
Sal and I are both just old enough to have bought that new off the shelves.
Oh, for sure.
Do you remember, what was your reaction to that, Chris?
I was such
he knew it was brilliant the moment he saw it.
No, I was such a Frank Miller fan, but I was also a big John Byrne fan. And so the first time I saw Elektra Assassin, I was like, this is some weird looking shit. It was not a fall in love with it right away. It's the first time I had ever seen a painted comic. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, okay, this is different. And it was also the realization, my parents probably shouldn't know that I'm reading this.
Yeah, I am always curious about how these comics land when they come out, because that's a book I came to later. Watchmen, Dark Knight, you know, those books had been out for a few years before I got hold of them. So they were already, they were already a certain thing. Like comics had reacted to them in a lot of ways, especially
that
Watchmen and Dark Knight.
DKR probably prepared us for that a little bit more, because DKR didn't look like anything else that was out, and it was adult. And so by the time that Electro Assassin comes out, I think you were probably primed to not be like, what the fuck is this, and throw it aside. You knew that something
Not me.
was there.
I hated it. I
think there was a lot of negative reaction to it. And like, we interviewed Bill Sienkiewicz, and in my mind, it's like, this is one of the greatest comics, like in a lot of ways, one of the most impressive comics I've ever read. And I think it holds up well over time.
Oh yeah.
But I don't think that was the reaction. And
No.
so like, when I would talk to him about it, when we interviewed him, it seemed like in his brain, it was a different reception to that book than in my brain, where I'm like, this is one of the monumental, first painted comic, and, mixing media and doing all these different things that just, I don't know where else they were done. And now they're done everywhere. And so, in my mind, it's this important classic, but I felt like he had like scar tissue from when it came out. And I think he described it as like there was nothing, there was like no sound whenever it came out. No, like people just didn't know what to do. But, in a time whenever and I think a lot of people were damaged, cartoonists, by the reception of Dark Knight and Watchmen. I think that those books came out and they were so huge and recognized as huge instantly, that a lot of other really great work from around that time period, it was kind of like, well, we talked to Howard Chaykin, and he had this reaction about American Flag, which in my mind is like, that's this book, another classic that changes everything. And his reaction was just much less like it was that giant monumental change. And I think it's because you're sharing a studio with Frank Miller and you're watching like a supernova, going past you in the background. And so maybe it changes the way you measure, a book like American Flag. But historically, like, I look at it and think there's so much in American Flag that's still around in comics today.
Oh yeah. That was the book. Well, I've talked about it ad nauseum on the podcast about that was the book that changed my thinking of comics. Like, oh, comics are not what I thought they were. They can be a lot different. They can be something. Yeah, I love that book. To this day, I still, and talking to Howard Chaykin was one of my favorite things ever. He's just such a great guy. But I wanted to ask you about your work and your style of art, and because you
styles,
styles, yes, I should say that, styles, and I'm always curious. Jeffrey Brown is a guy who we've had on the show multiple times, and Jeffrey's work, when he's most of his books are very cartoonish, sort of simple. I don't want to say that in a derogatory term.
They're Jeffrey Brown. I'm
a fan of his work.
But it's not. He can do whatever he wants. Mm-hmm. And he chooses to do that. And I look at your work and it's like, okay, Street Angel is in a certain style, but then you come out with these pen drawings on notebook paper that are incredibly detailed and super real, hyper realistic. And it's like, wow, this guy can do whatever the hell he wants to do. So I'm just kind of curious, like, is it with something like Street Angel or obviously Afrodisiac is a little different because there was a mood that you were trying to capture, I think, with that. But is it more of a production thing? Is it more of a, getting the work done as quickly as possible? Or is it a stylistic thing or a combination of those things?
It's probably a combination of all those things. I do tend to think it's hard for me to identify my own style. I tend to try to make things visually work based on the story. But if I were thinking of style, that would be it. Is this like, it's a package, Chris, you probably understand that as a graphic designer, where it's kind of like all of the pieces, I'm going for that package, that finished, complete thing. Yeah. Some of it does reflect like, I have a new idea on how to do this. So as an artist, I want to try this new thing.
Right.
And some of it is just, like Street Angel is a good example because I had done Street Angel as a traditional pen and ink, black and white type of book. That was the first published thing I did. And I loved guys like Charles Burns and Dan Clowes and, all these people that I think of as really in control of that ink line. Whenever I did the Image Street Angel series, it was a full color series. And it was, over 10 years later. And I had just taken in so much more art. I started looking at picture books, which have become a big influence on me. And, production and color changed. Like when I was started out, if you were doing indie books, they were black and white. That was it because of cost and technology and all these things. Whenever I get to like doing Street Angel at Image, you can do anything you can come up with. You know, you have access, like I'm delivering them files that they will just kind of look at and then send on to the printer. And I've had, you know, that's most of my relationships with Ad House. When I did Afrodisiac, it's like, here are finished files, you know, please look them over because they're kind of weird, but you know, they were prepared to go to the printer. You know, so like, it's a huge amount of control. You know, it's not just drawing, like you get to do everything, the pre-production, you know, really get it ready to print. It's the reason I'm doing Octobriana 1976, because of that kind of control. You get these ideas where it's like, well, I can do this production method and it will yield these results. What story would fit this thing that I think will look cool? So sometimes I have that idea of like, there's just a method that I have in mind. Like for Octobriana 1976, the whole concept is it's a blacklight comic. It's going to be printed with, instead of CMY ink colors, it's going to be printed with fluorescent ink colors. And so like, this was an idea I've been carrying around for years and years, trying to find the right story for it. You know, so that's what I'm thinking of.
How many, from a graphic design standpoint, how many colors are you printing in this thing? Because there's spots. It's all spot color, right?
It is all spot colors. I'm literally replacing the CMY with the fluorescent blue, yellow, and pink, and plus the black. But with fluorescent inks, you need to hit them twice. It's called like charging them, and that's what gives them their actual fluorescent quality. So that's a little bit tricky.
It's a double hit to make them opaque enough, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, it's almost like 7 colors in that you're running 2 of those 3 colors twice. And then from that, my palette is almost like, I think I have around 8 main colors that I'm working with. And so those colors are, you know, would represent mixes, right? It's almost like your crayon box as a kid. So like I have an orange, which is, you know, yellow, a little bit of orange,
a little bit of pink, you know, makes a
good green in there. So I don't know if that answers your question, Brian.
No, for sure. I like I said, I was just curious, you know, just on the ideas of different things, and that makes perfect sense. Once you said it, it made absolute sense to me that you're looking at it as a complete thing. You're looking at, this is a story from, you know, front to back page, and you have
even cover
control.
To cover, man. It is a book. You know, it's really a whole piece. And with Street Angel, I had been looking at like pencil art was something that you really couldn't reproduce well. Whenever I was coming up, you know, you would see occasionally Gene Colan or somebody, they'd reproduce his pencils, and it was neat, but it wasn't done very, you know, like it was hard to do from a production standpoint, say in the 80s. And so now you can do it. You can reproduce almost any mark really, really well now. And so once I started playing with color, I was like, the color works better, especially if you're sort of, you know, blending colors and doing some things other than just flat colors. It works really well with the pencil line. I don't think it works as well with a flat black line, like an ink line, if you're doing modeling and textures and stuff in the color, because the black line is so flat next to like gradients and, you know, light sources and all these things. But I found the pencil line works really well because it has some texture, it has some value differences. And so that was part of like some of the Street Angel books at Image are pencil instead of ink. And that's the reason. I just thought it worked better with the color. So
I love in the first Street Angel storyline, some of my favorite parts is like you'd go from these wild, crazy fight scenes or something, you know, very loose and sort of eclectic, and then all of a sudden there'd be this one panel that was a close up, and it was like, oh, there's some Charles Burns sort of like really highly rendered ink lines. I'm like, that's awesome. I love that juxtaposition in the middle of a page of just like, oh, wait a minute, that's like a completely different look right there, but it worked so well. I loved it.
Yeah, I wear a lot of influences on my sleeve, I think.
Well, so and that's part of, if you're going to be able to float between so many different styles, it, as a comics fan, it's great to see, oh, I see a little bit of this guy here or a little bit of this guy here. And that's, you know, I mean, you're kind of like a multi-sport athlete where it's like, okay, what discipline do you want to show in this project? You know, they're you know, it's like one of your Pittsburgh buddies, Tom Sholey. Tom is awesome. When you see a Tom piece of art, you know it's Tom. It's, you know, and that's him, and he has his style. But you have been able to float between so many different, looks and styles, which I think it's always, it's a box of chocolates whenever you get a Jim Rugg book, which is great.
It reflects a lot of the stuff I like too. Whenever my first book that was published was Street Angel, and it was with a small publisher, SLG. We had no budget. We barely sold any. So like, I couldn't do anything too fancy. I couldn't hire, Jim Lee to do a back cover or a pinup. But as a reader, like that's what I came up loving, especially like the Marvel DC characters. I really think, if you think of a literary character, it has to do with like character arc and growth, like if you're thinking of a novel in the traditional sense of character. And licensed comics just don't do that. Spider-Man at the end, 30 years in, he's still Spider-Man. And so the way these characters develop, I think, is by having different artists interpret them. And pretty soon you have almost this three-dimensional quality to this character. And so I always like seeing different artists, especially artists I like, with their interpretations. I like Ditko Spider-Man. I like McFarlane Spider-Man. And, that's part of why I reference all these different styles, because it's part of the fun for me. And in a way, it's almost like if you think of a big budget film where it's like, now you get this orchestral score, or you get these great special effects and set piece, with comics, like what are the equivalent of those things, and it might be doing that super blowout action scene that's scratchy and kinetic everywhere. And then you have that moment, you have that John Woo slow motion of like the birds flying through the chaos and violence. How do you do that in a comic? And maybe you do it switching up styles or having more detail where like now you've slowed down the reading pace because this one panel is just loaded with detail and it causes the reader to slow down, so they're tools that can be used, in making those comics too. And also it's hard to draw characters the same way all the time. So you can cover up maybe
now
a
the
weakness.
truth comes out.
Thank you for
Exactly.
saying that. That seems like I'm a failed artist, not a very good artist. I still draw to this day occasionally, and that was like the thing I could never understand how anybody did that worth a damn. It was like, how do you make this character look the same? I mean, I can understand it with Spider-Man. That's why Spider-Man wears a mask.
But how does Mary Jane look the same?
Yeah, I never understood it. It's
Also like, if you think of the Image guys that I loved at the time, they would always have these money shots. They were criticized for having, it's all pinups, right? Like it's just these full page splashes of their characters looking cool. Exactly.
Benjamins.
But there's an equivalent that's like the fun side of sitting at the drawing table that has that, you can translate that same excitement where it's like, I have this idea for a really cool Street Angel moment here, this image, but maybe it is in a different style than whenever she's hanging out with her friends at school. Like this is the badass coming into the fight, the cavalry arriving. Maybe I channel a little bit more of a, of a Jim Lee or a Jack Kirby or something that's switching from like the slice of life fun kids at school to like the ninja has arrived
on a skateboard with a sword.
Yes.
I want to know, before we go back to, because I want to talk more about the Blacklight fluorescent comic, but I want to know, when are you going to make a Count Dante comic? Because I think it is perfect for you. I'm waiting for it. I'll be the first person to buy it. I don't know why there has not already been a Count Dante comic, but I feel like you are the perfect person to do that story.
That's got to be near and dear to you guys' heart, right? Like the bulk of his career is Chicago.
South side of Chicago, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, man, I agree with you. I think that would be an amazing comic. The thought has crossed my mind, certainly. I don't know if you can get away with it. Like, I imagine maybe the Black Dragon Society would come after you or something.
Those guys are
I don't
all
know.
like
He's an amazing character.
What a story. I mean, you don't even have to fictionalize much. I mean, that guy's story is so crazy. It's Tiger King level of lunacy and weirdness and amazing, truly an amazing kind of guy. But
it'd be an extraordinary comic.
Yeah.
I'm surprised it doesn't already exist. And maybe right now people are working on it as they hear us talking.
Somebody needs to do one.
You're going to need to beep out this whole section.
Just cut it. Yeah. Too late. All right.
So Jim, there are three comics I have a tendency to give out to people that I think are receptive to reading comics that aren't, Batman, Superman, Spider-Man. It's like those folks. It's like, hey, I got something that I'm gonna let you borrow it, or I actually buy extra copies because I know that they never come back to me. It's Rich Kozlowski's The King, which I think is a great comic for, Elvis fans, and just
Sure.
kind of weird. Black Hole,
Man,
for
love
like
Black
horror
Hole.
fans, and just kind of off center stuff, and Aphrodisiac. Those are the three comics that I find myself like giving out or handing out. You are such an ambassador to comics, and I mean, you stand on that the model of make more comics. What are the comics that you give out to people to say, hey, read this? This is something I think you will dig.
Oh man, I don't do a ton of that. Ghost World is something I've given out. Dan Clow's Ghost World, of course, a movie at this point, but
Also a Chicagoan.
There you go. Chester Brown's I Never Liked You is a comic book that I've given out. These are actual comics I've given to people. So this is kind of good. I don't know if these are the best ones if I thought about it, but
And
these
he
are ones I've
wants 'em-
actually given people.
He wants them back. God damn it! He's giving them
Yes,
out.
I'm
and
looking for
nobody-
I want my records back.
The Crow, James O'Barr's The Crow, I gave to my prom date and never got back.
No.
So I ended up rebuying that one. I've actually rebought all these. The comic that I've bought the most of in my life, there's two of them. Donna Matrix is one. And that's Mike
Matrix.
Saints, who
Wow.
did computer comics, the first one being Shatter.
Yes.
Donna Matrix is pretty wild. And it's
Okay.
like the early 90s. And it's there are scenes from Donna Matrix in the Matrix movie. It's strange considering the title and the similarities and like the 6-year gap or whatever between the two. And then the other one is another Chicago person. It's Radio and Illustrated Guide, which Jessica Abel made. She used to do a lot of nonfiction comics out of Chicago, I think is where she started making comics from.
Mhm.
I remember getting like mini comics that were like her journalistic comics, probably in the late 90s. But she teamed up with Ira Glass from This American Life. And so for like a subscriber giveaway one year, they made this comic, Radio and Illustrated Guide. And it goes through an entire episode of This American Life. And it's like an 8-month process from like brainstorming until the thing actually goes on the air. And Ira Glass co-writes it. It's very wordy. It's not the most exciting comic to read, but as a how-to for like putting a story together, it's incredible, man. It gets into like Ira's ideas on interviewing people, shaping a story, editing. It's a pretty interesting comic. And I've bought and handed out lots of those.
Awesome.
Didn't you used to do or do you still do a podcast on NPR? Didn't you do a podcast? Or...
No, I never did one on NPR, but I did do a podcast called Tell Me Something I Don't Know. And then like Boing Boing serialized it for a while.
Okay. That's
or
what it was.
syndicate, whatever that is. Like Boing Boing hosted and promoted it for a while. I did that for a couple years because, I would listen when I started doing comics full time and quit my day job. I was just home alone and I would look to listen to something, especially when I'm inking or coloring. You can kind of let that part of your brain engage. And so I would listen to whatever I could find, like streaming radio, and then podcasts started. And after listening to podcasts nonstop for a couple years, I had to make one because I was like,
I
don't know.
This. These guys are idiots.
I like to know how things are put together. So the easiest way to figure that out is to do it yourself.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We did it because we were like, we know more than these assholes. I mean, we didn't, but we thought that we knew more than those assholes.
Well, my trick was I got a bunch of smart people on my podcast so that I could just learn how to be better at life. So it was artist and cartoonist, and it was my chance to kind of like pick their brains and, keep teaching myself how to do this.
Nice.
Well, that's what we're doing now.
I've got one more question. I know Sal has a couple lined up. I have one more question.
Yeah.
I'm done.
You're completely done.
Ed Piskor and Tom Scholey, also Pittsburgh guys, have both done grand designs with Marvel. Are you gonna tie the knot and make it the Pittsburgh coalition on grand designs? Is that anything that you're interested in? And if it was, what Marvel property would you do?
I would be interested in doing that. Probably, like I think about this a lot. People ask this a lot. That
Okay.
70s era of like Marvel horror weird comics is probably what I would like to do. With Ghost Rider would be kind of the champion of that group, but it's all like the Son of Satan's, that's Werewolf
Brother
by Night.
Voodoo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's such a weird era of comics. It's almost like I don't know, like the editor turned their back or something, because it's whenever they get that distro deal ends with DC Comics, and now like Marvel's super popular and now they can publish as many books as they want. And so they just flood it. And it's like, they don't have enough editors or something to control stuff. I mean, just like Son of Satan is on the rack next to Spider-Man.
Yeah. Well, I think the CCA restrictions had been lifted, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so I like that era because that's about as weird as you're going to find in Marvel Comics. I don't know what the grand design like title would be for that, but it's just like 70s, Marvel goes wild or whatever. It's like like the teenage years of Marvel Comics.
Yeah, Bronze Age.
I would like to do beyond like Marvel. I would like to do a grand design on NWA wrestling because a lot of that stuff predates video, but we have the history of it. And I feel like that could be really cool.
I just finished reading The Death of the Territories. You ever read that? That was an interesting
I haven't
book.
read that.
It's pretty good.
I read a lot of wrestling books, but I haven't read that one. It's on my radar. Is it good?
It was pretty good. I mean, it's a little dry. I mean, it's not terribly exciting, but it's informative and interesting I didn't know a lot of that history about the territories and then the inevitable, sort of takeover by Vince McMahon and how he did it and that kind of thing. So that was kind of interesting to me to sort of learn. I had an idea for a story about like like that era of wrestling, and so I started doing research and I came across that book. I work with a guy who does a very popular wrestling podcast, which I wish I could remember the fucking name of it, but I can't remember.
I will look it up.
Look it up. But yeah, it was. So I read that book, but it was pretty interesting. It's not. It's a little dry because a lot of it is just sort of like the history and this is what was going on in this territory and this is. So there's not a ton of the, awesome stories from wrestling.
Voices of Wrestling.
Voices of Wrestling. Yeah, that's Rich's podcast. We keep promoting other podcasts on here.
I know.
That's good. People need stuff to listen to now while they're working from home, while they're pretending to be busy working from home. I love wrestling because of that storytelling part. And maybe this will segue a little bit into Octobriana because there's some similarities there.
Sure.
But I read a book on Mildred Burke, who was a women's champion in wrestling for like 30s, 40s, and 50s. And the book was written by an investigative journalist as opposed to like a wrestling fan or a wrestling insider. So he was doing research, and some of these promoters, their papers are available. I think one of the big promoters out of New York, I think his whole, like all of his papers are at Syracuse or somewhere. I might be wrong on the school, but you can do research, like you can track down some documentation on this stuff. And some of it is public record, some of it was in local newspapers when a big wrestling event would come to town. And so he goes through this book and like, he'll have stories where there are like 3 accounts from like a promoter, a manager, Mildred's side of it, and then like her opponent's side, and then like the promoter's side, and they're completely different. And as a journalist, it's like he's finding paperwork from all of their accounts of this, and maybe a newspaper account on top of it, and they just don't add up. It's like the stories are just completely not the same story, even
it's like trying to research a Roy Thomas and Neil Adams comic book.
Oh, for God's sake.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
There are no stories line up here.
It's amazing though. Like if you're a fan of storytelling, it's incredible to kind of like get that glimpse behind the journalist struggling with like, well, which account do I go with? And sometimes it would just be like, here's the information. I don't know which of these is reliable. Maybe none of them are reliable. And it's fascinating because like every person involved is trying to advance their own narrative. And I mean, this is what nations do that go to war historically, right? Like you go through, and you wipe out the library of the nation you've conquered so that you can put your history on top of it. And that's what these wrestlers would do. So I find that really fascinating where it's like, good luck untangling what the truth of this stuff is, even if that's your intent, as opposed to, wrestling biographies, they're putting their story out there. But this kind of thing where a journalist is going in and trying to find the truth, and even they can't unravel these things. It's very fun as a storyteller to watch this. It's
interesting to think that, in an industry that is make-believe, that you would have, you know what I mean? And I don't mean that in a negative way, because I love wrestling too, but I can't remember. I was watching one of the Vice. They do the
Dark Side of the Ring.
Dark Side of the Ring. And I don't even know who the wrestler was because I had never heard of him before. But they were just talking about, like, his family would talk about how at the time when he was doing it, you couldn't be in public and not be your wrestling persona. Like, you would get in trouble. You might get fired, lose your job, whatever. So like he would drive with his family to the airport and then say goodbye. And as soon as he got out of the car, he turned into this gigantic, scary wrestler guy.
It's Bruiser Brody. I remember his wife was telling that story. She said she would watch him, like, take out his ponytail and transform into Bruiser Brody as he entered the airport.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's such a character. It's so similar to comics in so many ways. And also, this is really what, like, politics and our commercial journalism is today, is all of these stories. It's like you're battling to assert your narrative.
We're all the heroes of our own narrative. And
if you apply kayfabe to the world, it will make a lot more sense. It really does.
It's taken, I mean, I don't know if you guys have had the same experience, but, like, once I hit my 40s, it was like this weird realization that, you know, so many decisions by people in their lives are made by, like, ego and that sort of thing of, like, it's like people are not very honest about who they are or if they're happy or what they're doing, or, you know what I mean? And it's like they make, like, really terrible decisions and then try and make up for it and try and justify it or lie their way out of it. And it's like, I never understood that. I've always been a pretty straightforward person. Like, I'm kind of who I am. This is who you're full of shit. But
damn video.
Yeah. But it wasn't until, like, I hit my 40s, like, wow, people make a lot of crazy decisions because of ego and, like, you know, this weird narrative that they're trying to push about themselves. And I think they're even trying to believe it, you know, like, people, you know, we're trying to convince ourselves who we are, I think, a lot of the time. So it's interesting how you can look at everything going on in the world today and it's that same thing, crazy things that people are trying to push as reality. What ends up being reality? I don't know. Whatever is the most popular becomes the reality, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, a lot of the, I don't know what the right word is for this, but almost like the anxiety that we see kind of going through social media, for example, or mass media for that matter. I think a lot of it has to do with that fractured reality. You know, like when we started this conversation about how we all had 3 channels of television when we were little kids. That's a very controlled vision of the world. Sure. And now you think like 2 million people or 2 billion people or whatever on social media, you know, those are all channels. Like, that's all glimpses of reality. And there's just no way to reconcile it. You know, like, there is no one reality. It's all based on perception and perspective and things. So
Walter Cronkite at one time was the most trusted man in America. Whatever he said was belief. You know, everyone believed it. It was the truth, whether it was or not. I mean, is there anyone anywhere today that people believe? You know, like, there's no one. No. There's no one that is a trusted source in the world about anything. Like, it's bizarre.
Which is probably a lot more true than whatever Walter Cronkite was spinning. Right. You know, even if it was well intentioned, you know, it's just, we just did not have that perspective that we have now, and that's tough. It's hard to reconcile. It's very comforting to think, like, this guy will tell us what's what each night, and you know, I'll go to bed and not have to worry about it.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, I know that before Jim leaves us tonight, we absolutely want to spend some more time talking about Octobriana.
Yes.
This is Octobriana 1976.
Yes.
This
just rolls off the tongue.
Yeah. This is your, as you said, already completed project, but it is on Kickstarter now. And we talked about the fluorescent printing process, but go ahead, give us some background on the character, because it's really this is not, you did not create this character.
Correct.
So
yeah.
Fascinating story. So tell us about the project, why you're on Kickstarter, all that stuff.
All right. So the character Octobriana comes from a book from 1971 called Octobriana and the Russian Underground by Peter Sadecki. And so this book showed up. I found it through one of those, like, books about weird comics. And the idea is in the 1960s, a group of dissidents in the Soviet Union created this character, superhero character, very inspired by Western superheroes, created this character basically to fight Soviet oppression that was, you know, of the 60s from the Soviet Union. And they would publish them in what they called samizdat, which were zines. It literally means publish it yourself. So there was these little underground newspapers or magazines. And this author smuggled a bunch of these out of the Soviet Union. He was a Czech author, and he was like visiting as a guest lecturer or something like that, and got connected to this group that was making these comics. So he smuggles these out of the Soviet Union, and they publish them in England. And the guy that publishes them is this very sort of a right-wing type historian, journalist, publisher, writer. And so I think he identifies this character as being revolutionary and, you know, advancing his world view. So he publishes this book. Years later, it turns out to be a hoax, but no one knows it at the time of publishing. And I don't think the publisher knew it. You know, like, he writes an intro for it and really positions it as if like this is going on and this is important. It was the cover of is it The Guardian? One of the big newspapers in London. It made the cover like in advance of the book's publication. So it was a big deal, like a legitimate thing of like, this is exciting, what's happening in the world. It was exposed as a hoax eventually. But what happened is the character is public domain because it's presented as this underground character. And so the conceit of my book is that American underground cartoonists found it in the 70s. It was published in 71. And so as a show of solidarity with their fellow Russian underground cartoonists, they decided to make their own American underground comic of Octobriana. And that's Octobriana 1976. And it is printed with this blacklight technique because I was looking for something in the 70s because that's when I think of blacklight. You know, like blacklight posters. And so like it all just kind of fit together. You know, I started this because I did a screen print that was blacklight in, I think, 2014. And in the process, I was like, I think you could print this like an offset comic book and just do spot colors instead of CMY. And so I talked to Chris Pitzer at Ad House Books, who I did Afrodisiac with, I did notebook drawings with. He's somebody that knows print inside and out and that I've done a bunch of books with, including fluorescent ink on the Street Angel hardcover that he published. So we got to dabble with fluorescent ink there. And he seemed to think that it would work also, this idea I had to like swap out the inks. And so then it was just a matter of figure out a story that fits. And Octobriana was something that I was fascinated with just as a book. You know, we've kind of established that I love comics history. And this is one of the weirder books that I have found in comics history. And the more I started thinking about it, like it's this big, you know, kick-ass superhero woman, fun to draw, looks really cool. And the setting and the time period were perfect. And so sprinkle in maybe a little bit of Mike Mignola's Amazing Screw-On Head as inspiration, you know, to create like a one-shot contained in one comic book adventure that's a little bit fun, a little bit funny, and action. And, you know, it was a bunch of stuff that I wanted to draw, like she's fighting Soviet oppression, and that Soviet oppression is the gigantic robot Stalin. The manifestation.
Robot Stalin sealed the deal for me.
Yes.
I was like, yes.
So that's the project in a nutshell. And it's on Kickstarter because what happened is I was working on a graphic novel this year, and it was put on delay for a few weeks. Mm-hmm. And I had this story just kind of popped in my head in like 2 days time. And I wrote it and I thought, all right, I'll see if I can get this done. And I was doing a bunch of tours this year, different comic book shows, you know, as a guest or just going as, you know, as an exhibitor, because I had Street Angel Deadliest Girl Alive, the Image collection came out in November last year. And then I had the Plain Janes come out the beginning of this year in January. So it was like about 750 pages worth of my comics were published in, you know, a couple of months in the beginning of this year. And I was going to do a bunch of conventions to promote those. And I thought, I'm going to make this book with Ad House Books. We're going to publish it. Mm-hmm. And we're just going to show up at conventions with what I think will be the best looking comic book ever because of this fluorescent ink. Like it is going to scream at you from a great distance. And so that was the plan. And then COVID happens and we're all home and there are no conventions. And I have this book that I am itching to see in print. And what do we do with it? So Kickstarter comes to the rescue in a lot of ways. And I like, you know, like I handle everything. I handle a lot of this stuff from production details that a lot of cartoonists don't do themselves to also like, how do I actually get this in front of people? And I'm always looking at distribution. I've wanted to do a Kickstarter since I heard of it. And I just never had the right project. And it seemed like this might be the right project and the right time. You know, the book was done. I could really concentrate on whatever the experience with Kickstarter turns out to be. And it has been kind of a busy experience. So it works out well that the book is drawn and ready to go. And I think it's a chance, hopefully, to get my work in front of a bunch of people that maybe haven't heard of me before. Because I do think different people interact with comics in different places. So I plan to, make sure this book goes through Diamond eventually and gets into comic book shops because I love them. But I know there are comic book readers outside of comic book shops, and Kickstarter is a chance for me to experiment with, can I reach more readers that way? So it's been exciting. It's been busy. We're just kind of starting in a lot of ways. The Kickstarter's only been going for about a week. I started it,
but totally funded.
Totally funded. Yeah. I mean, at this point it's happening
by like a lot.
It's going well. Yeah. Yeah, it's going well. So thank you everybody that has supported it so far. Please keep sharing it. I mean, what happens is, and I hunt these books down, these things that are interesting. There's a company in Chicago that does risograph printing of Ghanaian movie poster paintings. And, like these books come and go, like you hear about them 2 months later and they're sold out. So, if you like this book, if you like this idea, please share it, because it is going to be a different looking book. No other comic looks like this. And it's not something you can just print on demand if people want an extra copy. What we print is all there's going to be. So the Kickstarter is a good way to get hold of a copy.
Where do I find a Blacklight these days? There's no head
that one's
shops,
on you.
I used to have them. I don't have them anymore. So I gotta.
I feel like I would look at Spencer's, the last mall store. Like, man, show me a shopping mall that doesn't have a Spencer's.
Yeah, right.
They bought up all of the remaining Blacklights.
I think so.
They're done after that.
And it looks like you have some great special offers on there too. Depending on the contributions, you have a bunch of prints and different things that you're offering as well.
Yeah, the prints are Blacklight Prints. Same thing, except they're screen printed instead of offset printed. And this goes back to the first experience I had with Blacklight. Printing or making something was a screen print, and the response was really strong to that. So I'm reprinting that print. And I'm making 2 new prints. One is an Afrodisiac print, Chris, that you're going to probably want maybe in the background of your
dope.
Videos.
Pretty dope.
And then one is an Octobriana print. So, yeah.
I already have Jim Rugg artwork in my background.
Well, that's what I like to see. Those are my favorite podcasters.
I got to stop listening to you, man, because every time I listen to you, you cost me money. Whether it's your product or somebody else's, I end up spending money. But I love it. I honestly, seriously, the show you and Ed do, I absolutely love your enthusiasm for comics, because it's been a roller coaster over the years for me. There's times where I've loved comics. There's times where I don't love comics so much, or I fall out of love with comics. And, to see you guys have that sort of passion for it still, and just the pure enthusiasm, it comes off so much when I watch you guys. So thanks for that. And the stuff you make as well. Like it just, both of you guys do such a great job with your comics, and the love of comics is all in there, and you can feel it. So I appreciate that stuff so much.
Well, thank you, Brian. I'm glad to hear that, because, there have been dark times in my life where comics really kind of saved me in a lot of ways. But as I said earlier, I can't imagine a better time to be a comics fan. Like I'm the biggest mark of all when it comes to comics. I end up costing myself a lot of this money too. So I just tend to do it before I announce to the world, hey, look at this thing. So, it's pretty genuine, and it's kind of been a real shot in the arm for me doing the show with Ed, because it is, when we first met, we would meet up every week at New Comics Day, and we would bring our pages along, and you did not want to not have something new. It was almost like positive peer pressure. And so we're kind of back at it again, where, he's making his new comic, I got to make my new comic. It's kind of great.
Feed off of one another.
Absolutely.
All right, I do have to ask you one other question, because I years and years ago, I went to a Comic-Con and I met Rick Veitch, And I love Rick Veitch's work, and anyone who knows Rick's work, it's out there. I mean, you talk about weird stuff. He's been doing weird stuff for a long time. And when I met him, I was like, really? That's the guy that makes this crazy, insane stuff? And I always wonder, like, have you ever had that sort of thing where, like, people have met you and sort of been surprised that you're the guy that's
You look so normal.
Yeah, you
Jim.
look like, I mean, a normal kind of guy. And it's like, well, really? This is Jim Rugg? I'm shocked.
Yeah, I get that a lot. I got it a lot the year after Afrodisiac was published.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I get it. I get it all the time. I mean, I did Afrodisiac, and I was not what anyone expected. I did Street Angel and the Plain Janes, and I was not what anyone expected. So I do get that a lot, but that's the world we live in now, man. It's real hard to figure out, like, just from a piece of art, like, who's behind it.
Right. It's just funny. It's just one of those things that I think is kind of.
One of my favorite parts about your art is your signature, which never ceases to crack me up.
Your signature? Why is his signature crack you up?
I
don't know your signature.
It looks like a 6-year-old signature, which absolutely cracks me up. As fine of an artist as you are, and you have this hilarious signature that I am like, are some of the letters backwards? It is. I will show you his signature. It is hilarious, and I love it.
That's very funny. It's completely unironic. It's just me signing my name.
Not a choice.
I thought I had the worst signature in
it's the one true Jim Rugg piece of style there, and
yeah, I love it. I
need to work on it, maybe.
Yeah. All right, well, Mr. Jim Rugg, it has been a pleasure to talk with you. Please know that you are welcome back anytime.
Absolutely.
You want to talk about your work or just comics in general. It's been a pleasure, man.
Well, thank you so much, Chris and Brian. Thanks for having me. This was great.
Unfortunately, we couldn't get Tom on. He had a flood. Today. He was planning on coming on, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. But yeah, thanks and
hope he doesn't keep his comics down there.
I know I had water in a room where, like, I had to build a shelf for, like, all my giant absolute editions that you made me buy. So and there was, like, water in that room. Like, no, God, not there.
That would be expensive.
Yeah, there's some stuff in there I would not want to have to try and replace, but. Tom wanted to be on, but thanks for coming on and tell Ed if he'd ever like to come on, we'd love to talk to him as well, for sure. So you guys do an awesome job, and thanks again.
Thank you guys so much.
All right, Jim, stay safe out there or in there or wherever you are, and yeah, have a good one, man. Thanks a lot.
Good night, guys.
Good night.
Good night.
And if I can get the outro, here we go. All right, we're off.
Comics.
Okay.
Nope. And he's
Okay.
gone.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, he left. Shit. That's the hard part of, like, trying to end the show live and then not be